In the first scene, we hear Marie calling her ex-husband Julian and telling him that their son Mathis is in trouble. While Julian was on the train, he thought about his missing son. His own helplessness plunged him into despair. After putting his things in the car's trunk, Julian met up with his ex-wife Marie. They hugged. Marie couldn't stand it any longer and cried. The day before, Mathis was at a children's sports camp, and the next morning he was gone from his tent, along with his sleeping bag. Later, Marie told Julian that she had already spoken to the police. The search for Mathis was well underway, but there were no leads so far. Julian asked how Mathis had been behaving the day before and if they had argued. After some hesitation, Marie replied that they hadn't and asked her husband to stop the car at the hotel. Marie also wanted her ex-husband to go into the house and find a photo of Mathis. It was unbearable for her to be there. Later, after receiving a call from the police, Marie learned that there was still no news. She is convinced that Mathis ran away on purpose to get back at her. Since Mathis learned about the mother's pregnancy, he became uncontrollable. Greg, Marie's new husband, tried to influence him, but in vain. This happened a few months ago, and their relationships have continued to deteriorate since then. Marie wanted to spend some time with Greg and take a break from her son, so she decided to send him to a children's sports camp for a while. Perhaps that was the last straw for Mathis. Julian couldn't get his head around what he has heard. He understands that he bears some responsibility in this, as Mathis needed a father. Marie often thinks about how this wouldn't have happened if they had kept the marriage together. Everything here reminds Julian of the past. As Marie requested, he went into the house and took a photo from an old photo album. Julian immediately met with the police officer, who said they had several theories, but it would take time to investigate. The officer was particularly concerned that the sleeping bag was missing, unlike the clothing. There is a possibility that it's a case of abduction. The officer asked Julian several questions about his son and his ex-wife. The last time Julian saw his son was last summer, and his relationship with his ex-wife remained normal after the divorce. The officer pointed out that a year ago, the judge handling their divorce made a proposal to significantly increase the amount of child support Marie received. Among other things, Julian refused to change the schedule of meetings with his son. Due to Julian's job that required a lot of travel, the officer asked him not to leave the country during the investigation. In Marie's house, Julian watched a video of the day when his son went to school for the first time. He as a father had missed many moments in his child's life. Greg tried to be a father figure to Mathis, but it wasn't enough. During the night, Julian couldn't sleep, thinking about his family that he couldn't preserve. Once, he and Marie were happy, but that was all in the past. Julian met with Gregoire, Marie's current husband. While Marie was sleeping, the men had some wine. Greg offered Julian to stay the night in Marie's house, but he refused. Julian was interested in how Mathis had been feeling before going to the camp. Greg said that Mathis had been a bit stubborn, but they wanted the best for him. The boy needed interaction with his peers. Gregoire enthusiastically talked to Julian about his plans to build a new house, which was inappropriate given the circumstances. Julian's bewilderment grew with each passing second, because Gregoire continued to act as if nothing terrible had happened. Julian began yelling at Greg, accusing him of being somehow involved in Mathis's disappearance. Eventually Julian attacked Gregoire, knocked him out and dragged him into the trunk of his car, before calling a police officer and asking for a meeting right away. The officer was bewildered to see Greg in the trunk, and despite protests, Julian was immediately arrested. Mathis's disappearance was all over the news. In the morning, Julian was released, but he continued to insist that Greg was involved because it was his decision to send Mathis to camp. The officer objected, saying that it was not Greg but Marie who made the decision. She had lost her baby a month ago and was very exhausted. However, Julian stuck to his opinion. He also didn't care that Greg had filed a lawsuit against him. According to the officer, Greg had a solid alibi. Everyone confirmed that on the night of Mathis's disappearance, Greg was at home. Julian watched the video of Marie and Greg seeing Mathis off at the camp. It made Julian cry. He felt helpless and tormented by the uncertainty. When Julian met Marie, she demanded an explanation. Greg is currently in the hospital, while Marie needed someone close to her. Julian said that Greg's behavior was suspicious because instead of worrying about Mathis, he was talking about his plans to build a big house. For Julian, this was abnormal. Marie yelled at the ex-husband, who had rarely shown interest in her or their son before. So he was not in a position to judge Greg's attitude toward the situation. Marie cried, feeling like she was losing her mind. Julian was confused, not knowing what to do now. Suddenly, he received a call from his new girlfriend and colleague, who asked if there was any news about Mathis. She also mentioned that the police had come and taken his documents related to the Middle East. While the investigation is ongoing, the woman didn't want to communicate with Julian because she feared for her life. Julian is a geologist who travels to hotspots for work, which comes with a lot of danger. The company guarantees the protection of its employees. At that moment, Julian had many thoughts in his head, but all of it somehow came down to his son. Determined, he went to a store and bought a SIM card. He spent the entire evening analyzing family videos, trying to find any leads. On one of the videos, he noticed a suspicious car and reached out to a friend who worked at a company providing information about the owner of vehicles based on its license plates. Julian asked that this be done anonymously. The next day, the friend sent him a message with information to his new phone number, and Julian immediately went to the address but parked further away. Julian walked to the house and peeked through the windows, but he couldn't see anything due to shutters. Then Julian kicked in one of the doors and entered the garage. First, he examined the car, and then he entered the house. Trying to be very quiet, Julian searched the rooms for clues. In the stove, he found a tattered sleeping bag and barely held back his emotions. There were sounds outside. The homeowner had returned. When he parked his motorcycle in the garage, Julian approached him from behind and knocked him out. The man woke up and couldn't move. Julian demanded that he tell him where Mathis was. Denying it was pointless because the burned sleeping bag was irrefutable evidence that Mathis had been here. The man refused to answer, so Julian made it clear that he would stop at nothing to find his son. In fear, the man cried out that he received a photo of Mathis and only delivered it, but he had no idea who those people were. Julian decided to help him remember with rather harsh methods. This prompted the man to confess that he had previously delivered Mathis to the White Cliffs, where an old resort is located. Julian wants to know what they intend to do with Mathis, but the man has no answers to that question. He is only involved in the delivery. Exiting the house, Julian burst into tears. Time was lost, and it's uncertain whether Mathis is alive now. But Julian was not willing to give up and headed to the White Cliffs. Julian no longer relies on the police for help, realizing that no one but him will save his son. Seeing a car passing by, Julian stood in the middle of the road. A man got out of the car and asked Julian what he was doing here. Julian lied, saying he had gotten lost. The man in turn explained that it was private hunting grounds and asked Julian to leave the area. Hearing a noise coming from the car's trunk, Julian asked what it was. The man replied that it was his dog. However, Julian wasn't convinced, and he pushed the man, then opened the trunk. There was indeed a dog inside. The man had an asthma attack, and Julian administered first aid, apologizing. After that, Julian ran away. It was up to him to find out who was really behind all this. There wasn't a minute to lose, so Julian didn't stop. Finally, he reached the old resort complex. It seemed like there was no one around. Julian was looking for clues when suddenly he heard a man's voice. Upon spotting a black car, Julian hid. A man came out onto the balcony of the second floor, talking on the phone. When he left, Julian deflated a tire on the car, then stealthily entered the building. Armed with a golf club, Julian made his way to the second floor. He opened each door quietly to avoid drawing attention. Nearby, male voices could be heard. Apparently, the men couldn't reach their accomplice and were worried that the police had caught him. There were 3 men. They decided they needed to leave as soon as possible. They had unconscious boys with them. However, their plans were thwarted by a flat tire. 2 of them returned with the boys to the building, while the third changed the tire. None of them knew that Julian was inside. Julian was seized with such rage that madness was the only way out. When one of the 2 men went out to check why their comrade was taking so long, he did not find him. The man returned to the building, calling for Matteo. In the meantime, Julian hid, waiting for the right moment. When the man left, Julian took the keys to the car from Matteo, whose life he had taken earlier. Matteo's disappearance made the men nervous, and they called him, unaware that Julian had his phone. Julian answered the call, saying that the police were on their way, and before they arrived, he would have found them. The men thought Julian was bluffing. One of them stayed to watch the boys, while the other, with a gun in hand, searched the building. At some point, he found Matteo lifeless. Julian accidentally made a noise, and risking being extradited, ran away. The second man grabbed a gun and went outside to see what was wrong. Julian hid on the stairs, contemplating how to outsmart the criminals. Upon hearing a noise nearby, one of the criminals began shooting. The men assumed Julian was downstairs. Seizing the opportunity, Julian ran back and found his son, who, like the other boy, was unconscious. But they were alive, and that was the most important thing. Julian took them both and carried them to the car while the men continued to search the building for him. One of the criminals found the second accomplice lifeless. Upon hearing the sounds of the car's engine, he rushed outside, but Julian had already left. The man fired shots and chased Julian for a while. The forest road was in very poor condition, but Julian kept driving. The situation was complicated by the fact that he was injured. At some point, Julian began to lose consciousness. Footsteps were heard next to the car. This was Julian's last memory. Someone approached the car with a flashlight. It turned out to be the summoned police officers. Some time has passed since these events. Julian, Mathis and Marie are now enjoying their time together, leaving all the bad things behind. Marie embraced Julian, thanking him sincerely for everything. From now on, everything will be fine. After hugging his son, Julian left because a police car was waiting for him. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel not to miss more exciting new products. Also, the authors will be pleased if you leave your opinion in the comments.